In 1927, 22-year-old John Carter was hanged by a lynch mob, riddled with bullets, and then he was tied to the back of a car and dragged through the streets of Little Rock, Arkansas. In the Florida panhandle town of Marianna, just south of the Alabama state line, a lynch mob tortured and hanged 23-year-old Claude Neal. His lifeless body was then tied to the back of a car and dragged for 2 miles to a local farm. This took place in 1934. In 1942, 25-year-old Willie Vinson was tied to the back of a car and dragged through Texarkana, Texas. The lynch mob then hung the man. Roughly 3 hours south of Texarkana, 49-year-old James Byrd Jr. was savagely beaten and tied to the back of a pickup truck in Jasper, Texas. He was then dragged until his body was battered and torn beyond recognition. The lynchings of John Carter in 1927, Claude Neal in 1934, and Willie Vinson in 1942 were carried out by lynch mobs that reportedly numbered in the hundreds. The lynching of James Byrd Jr. was carried out by just 3 men, but it was a lynching nonetheless, and it took place in 1998. My name is Michael, and the story of James Byrd Jr. will almost certainly leave you with some strong feelings. Sadness, anger, disgust, perhaps all of the above, but it's an important story, and I hope you'll stick it out until the end. The full newspaper article from my thumbnail is available at grimsilence.com, and if you think stories like this matter, please be sure to like and comment, and maybe even subscribe. In 1998, an unknown search engine called Google had just been launched. President Bill Clinton was in hot water after fooling around with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky, and Lauryn Hill's debut solo album, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, won critical acclaim when it was released in August of that year. Had James Byrd Jr. lived long enough to see the release of Lauryn Hill's album, chances are he would have loved it. Born to James and Stella Byrd, James Byrd Jr. grew up with 8 siblings in Jasper, Texas, where he would spend most of his life. Those who knew Byrd remember him as a man with a deep love for music. He could play both piano and trumpet, and his sister Clara Taylor described him as cheerful and spirited. He would walk through Jasper's streets singing and joking with people he encountered. James Byrd Jr. had big dreams, and he used to tell friends that he was going to put Jasper on the map one day. But Byrd also had his struggles. He had been in and out of Texas prisons on theft convictions and violating probation. After his release in 1996, James worked as a vacuum salesman, though by 1998 he was unemployed. He also suffered from seizures, which was at least part of the reason that he walked everywhere instead of driving. Renee Mullins, one of Byrd's 2 daughters, acknowledged that her father had a few flaws, but she said that he had gotten his life together after getting out of prison. He had secured an apartment, and things were starting to look up. Renee saw her father as someone who was genuinely trying to turn his life around. His family saw progress, even if it was slow and imperfect. James Byrd Jr. was trying to make his way in a small East Texas town that, like him, carried both promise and a complicated past. Less than an hour from the Texas-Louisiana border, the small town of Jasper isn't just deep in the heart of Texas. It's also deep in the heart of a region where lynchings were once shockingly common. By the 1990s, lynchings were practically unheard of, even in the Deep South. And Jasper, Texas, with its population of roughly 8,000, 45% of whom were black, was very progressive for its time. By 1998, Jasper had made what many residents considered meaningful progress in its pursuit of racial equality. The town's mayor was black. The hospital administrator was black. The last school board chairman was black, and he had served on the board for 17 years. Having black Americans in these positions of leadership was, at one time, unthinkable in East Texas. Racial conflicts had plagued the region for more than a century, but in 1998, many in Jasper believed that their town had risen above it. But Mary Verrett, one of James Byrd's sisters, saw the reality more clearly. She described how blacks and whites in Jasper coexisted but remained apart. They might work together during the day, but they went home to separate neighborhoods at night. They might shop in the same stores, but they worshiped in different churches and socialized in different circles. Integration on paper had not created integration in practice. Things were considerably worse in nearby areas where it was abundantly clear that racial hatred was still alive and well. Skinheads terrorized Dallas in the early 90s. In 1993, the Ku Klux Klan harassed black residents of a newly desegregated housing project in Vidor, Texas. Among other crimes, they were accused of offering to pay white children to attack black children. And in 1988, white law enforcement officers were accused of beating a black prisoner to death in the town's jail. The officers were eventually convicted. One of them was the local police chief. Meanwhile, Jasper residents pointed to their integrated schools, their black elected officials, and their relatively peaceful coexistence as evidence of progress. The town had largely avoided the racial ugliness that made headlines in other parts of East Texas. Many residents genuinely believed that they had created a different kind of community, one where race might still matter, but where violent racial hatred was a thing of the past. This belief would be tested in the early morning hours of June 7, 1998, when three white men shattered the illusion of racial harmony in the most brutal way imaginable. On the night of Saturday, June 6, 1998, James Byrd Jr. was surrounded by the people he loved most. He had gone to his parents' home for his niece's bridal shower. His 27-year-old daughter, Renee, had flown in from Hawaii with her 1-year-old baby girl. Many of Byrd's sisters were there, and Byrd held his baby granddaughter in his arms and bounced the little girl on his knee. Later that night, he left the party on foot. Walking from place to place in Jasper was not unusual for Byrd due to his seizures and the fact that he didn't have a car. As Byrd was leaving, he bid his sister Stella farewell by saying, "I'll see y'all. I love y'all. You're my big sister." That was the last time James Byrd Jr.'s family saw him alive. Just after 2:30 in the morning on June 7, 1998, three white men were driving through Jasper in a gray pickup truck. The owner of the truck, 23-year-old Shawn Allen Berry, was behind the wheel. With him were John William King, also 23, and 31-year-old Lawrence Russell Brewer. All three had done time in prison on either burglary or drug-related charges, and all had been drinking that night. Two of the men, King and Brewer, were avowed white supremacists with ties to the Ku Klux Klan, and they had the tattoos to prove it. The three men drove through town, eventually spotting James Byrd Jr. walking along the road. Berry recognized Byrd. According to some accounts, the two had reported to the same parole officer. Others said that the two men simply knew each other from around town. Regardless, Berry pulled over to offer Byrd a ride. According to Berry's later statement to police, King initially didn't want to pick up Byrd. More to the point, King didn't want to pick up a black man. But something made John William King change his mind, and he withdrew his objection. And with that, Byrd climbed into the bed of the pickup truck, thinking he was getting a ride home. The truck made a stop at a convenience store before continuing on. Upon leaving the store, King took over driving Berry's truck, and instead of heading toward Byrd's apartment, King drove in the opposite direction, taking them away from town and toward a remote wooded area about 10 miles from where Byrd lived. What happened next is very upsetting, and it is not for the faint of heart. Please proceed with caution. King turned onto a dirt road that led deeper into the isolated forest. At some point, King said he was fixin' to scare the shit out of the black man sitting in the back of the truck. What was supposed to be a friendly ride home had become a trap. King parked the truck and he and Brewer got out. What happened next was a brutal beating that left Byrd bloodied and defenseless. Lawrence Russell Brewer admitted to spraying black spray paint into Byrd's face while King fought with Byrd. One of the men slashed Byrd's throat with a knife, though this wound would not prove fatal. The two men then tied Byrd to the back of the vehicle as if they were reenacting one of the many similar lynchings from decades earlier. Byrd was secured to the rear of the truck at the end of a 24-foot-long logging chain. The chain was wrapped around his ankles. As King prepared to drive away with Byrd chained behind the truck, he made a reference that would only be meaningful to those familiar with racist ideology. King said, quote, "We're going to start the Turner Diaries early." The Turner Diaries is a white supremacist novel that depicts a not-so-distant future in which genocides are carried out on black people and other minorities. The book has been called the Bible of the Racist Right and a handbook for white victory. King put his foot on the gas and started down Huff Creek Road, and thus began the agonizing torture and murder of James Byrd Jr. According to Barry, Brewer turned around to watch Byrd flailing at the end of the long chain. He commented that Byrd was bouncing all over the place. King, Brewer, and Barry were fully aware of what was happening to the black man behind the truck as they dragged him down the road. Byrd struggled to stay alive as his body scraped against the unforgiving surface of the road. His clothes were torn away, as was much of his skin. Parts of his body were ground down to the bone. Byrd fought to lift his head and keep it from dragging on the pavement as the rest of his body was ravaged by the asphalt. After about 1.5 miles, or about 2.5 kilometers, the road curved sharply to the left. The truck turned, causing Byrd's body to swing violently to the right side. His head and right arm slammed into a concrete culvert with tremendous force. The impact was so powerful that it severed his head, neck, and right arm from the rest of his body. A pathologist would later testify that Byrd had been alive and conscious until this moment. The truck came to a stop near a black church and cemetery. King had chosen this location deliberately, wanting to send a message of terror to the black community. The three men dumped Byrd's torso at this spot, and then they drove away, leaving behind a scene that nobody in Jasper was prepared for. June 7, 1998, began as a beautiful Sunday morning in Jasper, Texas. The weather was cool, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and area churches would soon be welcoming parishioners. But by 8:45 a.m., a local resident walking near the Huff Creek Chapel and Cemetery made a discovery that would haunt the community forever. Scattered along the rural road were human remains so severely mutilated that investigators initially struggled to determine what exactly they were looking at. The victim's torso lay between the church and cemetery, completely unrecognizable as human. Byrd's head, neck, and right arm were found approximately 1 mile away from the torso, torn from his body hours earlier during this horrific ordeal. As was noted earlier, the placement of the remains was not random. A gang expert would later testify that leaving the torso between a black church and cemetery was intended to send a message of terror to the African Americans in the surrounding area. The nearly 3-mile route where Byrd had been dragged to his death was easily identified by local authorities. Byrd's wallet, tennis shoes, shirt, his dentures, smears of blood and flesh created a trail of evidence that would help police reconstruct this sickening crime. They marked James Byrd Jr.'s remains and scattered belongings with spray-painted circles. In all, 81 different spots had been marked. Sheriff Billy Rolls, a seasoned lawman who had seen his share of violence, was tasked with informing Byrd's parents that their son was dead. The sheriff went to the Byrd's home and wept when he broke the news. Byrd's wallet contained an identification card, but it was of little use in identifying the remains found on Huff Creek Road. The mutilation was so severe that visual identification against Byrd's wallet photo proved impossible. Margaret Tukes, who knew James Byrd, lived near the spot where Byrd's head and arm were found. She went to the scene along the road. She wanted to know if she knew the victim. Tukes later said, quote, "It hardly looked like a face. I know James, but I couldn't recognize him at all." Authorities had to rely on fingerprint records to confirm his identity. The crime scene revealed the method of murder in horrifying detail. Byrd's shredded torso was found shirtless, with his pants and underwear around his ankles. The evidence clearly showed that he had been chained by his ankles and dragged behind a vehicle. The 24-foot logging chain used in the attack was recovered at the scene, along with other physical evidence that would prove crucial in the investigation. While investigators processed the gruesome scene, they got an unexpected break in the case. A witness reported seeing James Byrd Jr. in the back of a gray pickup truck during the early morning hours. This witness account led authorities to trace the vehicle to Shawn Allen Berry, who owned a gray pickup truck matching the description. The three suspects had already attracted police attention for an unrelated crime. King, Brewer, and Berry were being investigated for a restaurant break-in after officers found them with a large supply of frozen meat. Physical evidence at the crime scene pointed directly to the three men. Investigators recovered a cigarette lighter inscribed with a triangular symbol and the name Possum. The triangular marking was identified by authorities as a symbol for the Ku Klux Klan. Witnesses later confirmed that Possum was John William King's prison nickname, establishing a direct connection between King and the crime scene. Additional evidence included tools etched with the name Berry, further linking Shawn Allen Berry to the murder. Perhaps most damning was the discovery of a spot of Byrd's blood on King's sandal, providing forensic evidence that placed King at the scene of the brutal attack. The three men claimed innocence, but investigators were confident they had Byrd's killers. However, one thing that authorities struggled with was the motive, and all they could come up with was pure racist hatred. But another, much more sinister reason for the killing would later be revealed in the courtroom. As violent and gruesome as Byrd's death was, it barely registered in local news media at first. A few local newspapers reported that a suspected hate crime had taken place in Jasper, but the story received very little attention when it first hit the presses on June 9th, 2 days after the murder was discovered. But by the following day, after word spread that Klan members had been arrested for the murder, the story went national. It even got printed in British newspapers and would eventually make front-page news in Australia as well. The quiet town of Jasper, Texas, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, and for all the wrong reasons. The town was already in shock from the horrifying manner in which James Byrd Jr. had been murdered, and the pain of that loss was about to be amplified by an enormous amount of unwanted attention from national news outlets. Television crews, journalists, and satellite trucks descended on Jasper, Texas, overnight. The people of Jasper feared that their town would be forever branded as a place of racial intolerance, the very thing they had worked so hard to keep at bay. Dealing with the fallout of Byrd's lynching and the events that followed would prove to be a monumental challenge, and Jasper would have to rise to the occasion while news crews documented every last moment. White residents of Jasper were quick to join their black neighbors in condemning the three white men who had carried out this atrocious crime. A pharmacist in town, speaking of the three killers, said, quote, "This is not Jasper. This is a bunch of idiots. I don't know any of these people. Everybody here is just upset." Teenage siblings Chris and Melissa Bush said, "We want to show that all people of Jasper are not racists." The two were out in the blazing Texas heat handing out yellow ribbons in remembrance of Byrd. And an older couple who owned a local business was asked for comment by the nightly news program Nightline. They said that the general sentiment around town was that they should build a gallows and hang all three of the perpetrators. Storefronts called for unity and asked for prayers, not just for the Byrd family, but for the town of Jasper as well. As arrangements were being made to bury James Byrd Jr., NBA star Dennis Rodman told the Byrd family that he would pay for the funeral. Rodman was known for seeking out the limelight with his goofy antics off the basketball court, but he was also a Texas native, and he was deeply moved by Byrd's death. And when the day of the funeral finally arrived, numerous public figures of prominence were in attendance. Among them were Reverend Jesse Jackson, Reverend Al Sharpton, and Congresswoman Maxine Waters. President Bill Clinton did not attend, but he expressed his condolences. While upwards of 1,000 mourners attended Byrd's funeral, armed members of the new Black Panther Party arrived in Jasper, but they stayed away from the funeral out of respect for the family. Instead, they marched through some of the black neighborhoods in Jasper with guns on full display, promising retaliation against any further attacks on the black community. A rather large escort of Texas Rangers and sheriff's deputies joined the march to make sure it was a peaceful one. Just a few days later, who else but the Ku Klux Klan showed up in Jasper to put on a display of their own? They claimed that they were there to denounce the murder of Byrd, but that didn't matter to local residents. Their presence was unwelcome. Members of the new Black Panther Party were ready to confront the Klansmen, and the standoff was tense at times. A small army of law enforcement officers from multiple agencies kept the two groups separated, and against all odds, they managed to keep the peace. John William King was the first of the three defendants to face trial for the murder of James Byrd Jr. Prosecutor Guy James Gray opened his case by focusing on King's many white supremacist tattoos. King's body displayed a burning cross, SS lightning bolts, and an image of a black man hanged. He also had a number of tattoos that showed satanic imagery. There was also evidence that King was trying to form his own white supremacist group. He was going to call the group the Texas Rebel Soldiers. King was extremely serious about this endeavor, and he had even drafted a constitution, bylaws, and a membership application. The prosecutor pointed to this plan to form a new hate group as a likely reason behind the brutal lynching of Byrd. The savage violence of the act was meant to drum up interest from other racists and attract new members to the fledgling offshoot of the Ku Klux Klan. In addition to King's lighter with the KKK symbol and the blood evidence found on his sandal, one other piece of evidence proved especially damning. While awaiting trial, King wrote the following in a letter to his co-defendant, Brewer. "Seriously though, bro, regardless of the outcome of this, we have made history and shall die proudly remembered if need be. Much Aryan love, respect, and honor, my brother in arms. Possum." 11 white jurors and 1 Hispanic juror deliberated for less than 2.5 hours before finding King guilty of kidnapping and dragging Byrd to death. For the first time in Texas since the mid-1970s, when the death penalty was reinstated, a white man was sentenced to die for killing a black man. The prosecution of Lawrence Russell Brewer also featured white supremacist tattoos, one of which displayed the words "Death Before Dishonor" arranged around the same Ku Klux Klan symbol seen on King's lighter. It is unknown what Brewer's Hispanic wife thought of this tattoo, or if she even knew what the symbol represented. In court, Brewer was unable to maintain the cold, unrepentant facade that one might expect from a white supremacist. Faced with the prospect of dying for his crimes, Lawrence Brewer was reduced to tears as he claimed innocence. He said things like, "I didn't mean to cause Byrd's death," and "I had no intentions of killing nobody." He blamed Barry, not King, for slashing Byrd's throat and chaining the man to the back of the pickup truck. Brewer even claimed that dumping Byrd's torso near the black church and cemetery was Barry's idea. The jury found Brewer guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death, placing him on death row alongside King. After the trial was over, Brewer wrote a letter to King. He wrote, "I do believe we are bigger stars, or should I say hero of the day, than what we ever expected." The two men were clearly proud of what they had done to James Byrd Jr. The last of the killers to go on trial was Shawn Allen Berry. Berry was singled out in the local media as the only one of the three who showed any remorse, signaling that perhaps there was hope for the accused killer. Berry claimed that he had tried to stop the attack but was threatened by King, who suggested that Berry might suffer the same fate as Byrd. Berry's defense attorney argued that Berry was essentially a bystander, under threat and paralyzed with fear, and that he was trapped in a situation that was beyond his control. According to Berry, he was so terrified by the actions of King and Brewer that he wet his pants, perhaps trying to embellish his claim of innocence. An examination of his clothing had revealed only trace amounts of urine. In his closing argument, the prosecutor told the jury, Shawn Allen Berry chose to be with King and Brewer. He chose to pick up Mr. Byrd. He chose to drive him to a secluded spot. He chose to beat him down, kick him, and chain him like an animal to the back of the pickup truck and drag him over 3 miles. James Byrd did not choose to be left decapitated in front of a church. The all-white jury found Berry guilty of capital murder, but they spared him the death penalty that his co-defendants received. Berry was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 40 years. Berry's first eligibility for parole will be in 2038. Despite the enormous tragedy of the lynching of James Byrd Jr., silver linings would emerge in several forms. As a way of honoring the memory of their beloved James, the Byrd family established the Byrd Foundation for Racial Healing. Their mission is to promote racial healing and cultural diversity through education. In 2018, the foundation marked the 20th anniversary of Byrd's death by unveiling a memorial bench on the grounds of the Jasper County Courthouse. The bench bears the message, "Be the change that you want to see in the world." Jasper also named a park in Byrd's honor. The most significant outcomes, however, were legislative. In 2001, the Texas state legislature passed the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act, which provided increased penalties for hate crimes such as those motivated by a victim's race, religion, or skin color. The federal response took longer but proved more comprehensive. In 2009, President Barack Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act into law. This federal legislation expanded hate crimes protections, and it included crimes motivated by sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. Just a few months after the murder of Byrd, Matthew Shepard was beaten to death in Wyoming for being gay. In 1998, the town of Jasper feared that it would become known for the lynching of James Byrd Jr. and nothing else. Thanks to several books, a cable TV movie, occasional mentions in the media, and, if I'm being honest, videos like this one, that might actually be true, at least to some. Jasper, Texas, and the lynching of James Byrd Jr. are inextricably linked. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's worth remembering how the people of Jasper came together in the wake of Byrd's murder. They showed unity and strength of character when it mattered most. And most of all, it's worth remembering James Byrd Jr. and the hard lessons that came from his horrific murder. Condolences to the family of James Byrd Jr. and anybody who was touched by this horrible tragedy. Society has made progress, but clearly we still have a long, long way to go. Thank you for watching.